Right, so we've covered those three basic aspects of exposure. In this week's video, what I want to do is try and tie them all together before we move on to talking about metering and other more complicated things related to exposure. This video is part of my ongoing Technical Basics Foundation course, which will teach you all the basic technical things you need to know to get started in photography. I'm releasing one video a week, generally on Friday afternoons, as regularly as I can. If you like what you're watching, hit like, of course, subscribe to keep up to date with things, and by all means stick comments below. I will get round to answering as many as I possibly can. And if you're after a full transcript of these videos, they're on my blog at photosmudger.com. So without further ado, let's look into bringing everything back to that exposure triangle. So far we've talked about aperture, shutter speed and ISO or sensitivity. And we've kind of taken something for granted, which is that our exposure looks right to us, okay? All we've done is we've played with the variables within those parameters, shutter speed, ISO, etc., to show what different effect they have, and we've generally assumed that the shot looks okay. We do need to look at what happens if the shot looks wrong, if it's too dark or too light. Now in the next video we're going to look at how your camera will arrive at those numbers it uses, the values of shutter speed, aperture and ISO. But for now let's have a little look at what things look like when they go wrong. Let's have a quick look at an image we've seen before, but this time we're going to deliberately get the exposure wrong and show you just how different it can look. Here are our two ducks, and this is what we would deem to be a correct exposure. All I'm doing across these shots is simply changing the shutter speed by one whole stop. We now see what it's like one stop darker, two stops darker, and now one stop overexposed, which is lighter, and two stops lighter, and now finally back to correct again. So we can see quite clearly that underexposing something, making it darker, or overexposing something, making it lighter, doesn't look as good as the correct exposure. Now there are definitely times when you can use either of these creatively to suit the shot in hand. As I think I've stressed before, there is no such thing as the perfect exposure. There certainly isn't a set number of factors that are exactly right. There isn't a perfect aperture to aim for, a perfect shutter speed, a perfect ISO. That isn't the case. What you've got to remember is that you are looking for the correct combination of those three for the situation that you've got in front of you. For the total amount of light you've got in front of you, you are trying to get the correct exposure. That's what we're looking to try and achieve. Now this is the perfect time to bring up the elephant in the room regarding exposure, which is how much light is there in the situation you're photographing. Thus far we've generally been talking about those three aspects of exposure in the abstract. Okay, we haven't really been dealing with any real world situations. We've just talked about if you have this aperture, this shutter speed, this ISO. But in the real world, you are going to have a certain amount of light. There is obviously a difference between a dark indoor room lit by small table lamps and things and a bright sunlit outdoor scene. And the amount of light you've got is obviously going to affect the choices you can make regarding aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Now initially this can actually be a little bit hard to get your head around because of course our eyes adjust to different scenes very, very quickly. I mean, we've all experienced, say, walking from inside a dark house or a dark room to a bright sunny day outside, and our eyes take a couple of seconds to adjust, but they adjust very, very quickly. And if you've only ever used a smartphone or a camera on fully automatic mode, then your camera, of course, adjusts its exposure to the point where you get an exposure that looks okay to you, and you don't necessarily recognise that the actual amount of light has changed quite dramatically. If instead you're in manual mode, as of course we are because that's how we learn better, if you're in manual mode and you're set for outside on a bright sunny day and then you walk into a darkened room and try and shoot, you will find that you are very, very underexposed, and the opposite is true. If you walk outside having set your camera for a darkened room and it's bright and sunny, you'll be very, very overexposed. This is a simple demonstration of the fact that the quantity of light, the actual amount of light that's in the scene you're photographing is very, very different, and that difference reflects in those values of aperture, shutter speed and ISO that you will end up having to use. So let me try and illustrate this with two real-world examples that are actually quite close to these hypothetical examples I keep talking about of the darkened room and the bright sunny outdoor scene. This first portrait is of the Irish comedian Dara O'Brien in a fairly dark pub, and the exposure value was 1/30 of a second at f4 and ISO 100. And this second portrait is of European Tour golfer Richard Finch, clearly outside on a bright sunny day, and the exposure was 125th of a second, f11 at ISO 100 again. Now, if you do a bit of mental arithmetic, or if you don't do it mentally, do it on a piece of paper in front of you, you'll realise that there was 5 stops difference in the total amount of light between the shot of Richard and the shot of Dara. Now, the amount of light you've got to play with will obviously affect your choice of those 3 exposure variables. Now, in both these cases, the exposure was correct, if you like. It gave me an okay shot, but the numbers I got were very, very different. The amount of light we've got to play with is obviously going to affect our choice of those exposure factors: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Thinking of that darkened room with Dara in the pub, we were at 1/30th of a second shutter speed and f4 on the aperture. If we wanted to freeze some motion, 30th of a second is not going to be a fast enough shutter speed, and we would need to go faster, and we'd need to compensate for that in some way. Given that we're probably already quite wide on the aperture at f4, it might be that we either can't open the aperture up more because the lens won't let us, or that we don't want to open the aperture up anymore because we're worried about having too shallow a depth of field. So it might be that our only option is to turn up the ISO and make the camera more sensitive. In doing so, we'll obviously lose a bit of quality in the image. Now, of course, the other way around that is to bring in more light, is to either add, say, some flash to it, or perhaps bring in some artificial continuous light like LEDs, but we can't escape the total quantity of light in the first place and the choices that will give us. Now, just in case you were thinking the easy way around this is just to have lots more light, having lots of light isn't always the answer. You might be outside on a bright sunny day, like the portrait of Richard Finch, the golfer, but it might be that you want a really shallow depth of field that you'd get from a very wide aperture. But even at your least sensitive, something like ISO 100, and with your fastest shutter speed, you can't open the aperture wide enough without overexposing. Now, in that situation, you need to reduce the light somehow. You need to either move to somewhere where there's less light, so perhaps under the shade of a tree, or you might need to introduce something like a filter, a neutral density filter, or a polarizing filter, which would cut the amount of light going into the lens. I'm not going to start talking about filters at this stage, it will only confuse you, but think of them as sunglasses, if you like, that cut the amount of light going through the lens and getting onto the sensor. Point being, you've always got to deal with that total quantity of light, and having more is not necessarily best. Now, if you've had your camera in front of you as you've been following these videos about exposure, and hopefully you've had it in manual mode as well, you've probably noticed that I've actually been skating over a little detail, and the number scales I've referred to for aperture, shutter speed and ISO don't seem to quite match what's in your camera. I've talked about ISO 100, 200, 400, etc. and shutter speeds of 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, but there are probably numbers appearing in your camera that aren't on that list. Well, small confession to make, I've not gone into too much detail just to keep things simple so far, but the number scale I've shown you is simply the headline scale, if you like, the one that shows a clear distinction of one stop between each number, each value on the 3 respective scales, and there are intermediate values that allow you to set a more precise exposure. Now, you can vary how precise you want this to be in your camera. It'll be buried somewhere in your settings. It'll be different for each camera, so I'm not going to try and tell you where to find it. Look it up in your manual. You may find you can set your exposures to half a stop of precision, but what's also very likely is you can set them to 1/3 of a stop precision. This is the point at which I like to work because it gives me enough precision and enough variation to allow me to to get better exposures, but it's not overly precise. And in fact, cameras, generally speaking, can't set more than 1/3 of a stop in precision, so it's as fine as you can get. This explains why you have probably seen numbers that I haven't mentioned yet. As an example here, watch me change the aperture from 5.6, which you've seen on the scale already, to 5, to f4.5, and down to 4. And now on the shutter speed, from 1/250th of a second down to 200th, 1/60th, and the familiar 1/125th. Now the same goes for ISO as well. There are intermediary numbers. Don't let this worry you too much. It's just a way of being more refined with your exposure so you can get a more precise and more accurate exposure. So, in this video we have talked about the total amount of light in a scene we're trying to photograph, and how that inescapably affects the choices you're going to have to make of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. We've also covered very briefly the fact that there are intermediary numbers between the big headline numbers and the scales that I've talked about. That's pretty much all the basics covered for exposure for now. Next video I'm going to talk about exposure metering and how your camera arrives at these numbers in the first place. Meanwhile, practice everything you've been covering so far. Make sure your camera's in manual mode so you can see the effects. Obviously hit like if you're enjoying what I'm doing, subscribe so you can get notifications, yada yada yada. Find the full transcript on the blog at photosmudger.com, and do stick any comments below if you want to answer any questions, and I'll do my very best to help. Bye bye for now.